I walked through the front door, dropping my bags onto the floor with a heavy thud. The familiar smell of home washed over me, a mix of fresh linen and something faintly floral. I took a deep breath, relishing the feeling of being back after the whirlwind 5-day trip with Rebecca. It had been years since we'd gone anywhere without the kids, and this trip was something of a milestone for us. Our first real adventure as empty nesters. The kids were gone, off to college and starting their own lives. It was just the two of us now. Just like it had been in the beginning. I smiled to myself, thinking about the past few days. We had laughed, really laughed, like we hadn't in years. The kind of easy, carefree laughter that only comes when you have nothing pressing on your mind, when the world slows down just enough for you to enjoy the moments. I had caught myself watching her a few times, marveling at how beautiful she still was after all these years. Her hair had lightened just a bit with age, but her eyes, they were the same. Bright, full of life, always a bit mischievous. I'd felt closer to her than I had in a long time. That connection we had built over the years, through the chaos of raising kids, through work, through everything, it was still there. Stronger, even. Or so I thought. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. Rebecca hadn't come to greet me when I walked in. I shrugged it off. Maybe she was in the back, still unpacking her things. I wandered into the living room, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the hardwood floors. It felt strange, this quiet. The house had always been loud. The kids were always up to something, always bringing their energy and noise with them. But now it was just silence. I sighed, a part of me missing the chaos. It was hard to believe we had reached this point in life. I sat down on the couch, sinking into the familiar cushions. My mind drifted to earlier moments, the sunsets we watched from the balcony, the long dinners where we talked for hours, the way her hand felt in mine as we strolled through the streets of the small town we had visited. For a moment, it had felt like we were young again, like those early days when everything was new and exciting. I closed my eyes, letting the peace of the moment wash over me. Dan. Her voice pulled me out of my thoughts. I hadn't heard her come in. There was something in her tone that made me sit up, something that wasn't quite right. I opened my eyes and saw her standing in the doorway to the kitchen. She looked off. Her shoulders were tense, and her hands were clasped together like she was trying to hold something in. Yeah? I asked, my voice light, trying to cut through the heaviness I sensed. Can you come to the kitchen? We need to talk. We need to talk. Those 4 words that never meant anything good. My stomach dropped, but I stood up anyway, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she just wanted to talk about something mundane, like how to rearrange the furniture now that the kids were gone, or something about the bills. But deep down, I knew this wasn't that kind of conversation. I followed her into the kitchen, my mind racing through the possibilities. Had something happened on the trip? Did I miss something? Rebecca stood by the counter, her back to me as I entered. The tension in the air was thick, and I could feel it settling into my bones. I leaned against the doorway, crossing my arms, waiting for her to say whatever it was she needed to say. She took a deep breath, her fingers tapping nervously on the counter. That wasn't like her. She was always calm, always the one who kept her cool no matter what. Finally, she turned to face me, her eyes wide and red-rimmed like she'd been crying. That was when the knot in my stomach tightened, and I knew, whatever this was, it was bad. Really bad. I don't even know how to start this, she said, her voice shaky. My heart was pounding now, thudding against my chest as if it was trying to break free. Rebecca, what's going on? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She wiped her eyes, but the tears kept coming. I'd never seen her like this. Never. Even during the toughest times in our marriage, she was always composed. But now, she looked broken. She began, her voice cracking, I've been seeing someone else. For a long time. Over 10 years. For a moment, the world stopped. I could hear nothing but the sound of my own breathing. I stared at her, my brain refusing to process the words she had just said. What? I managed to choke out, my voice strangled by disbelief. She didn't flinch. Didn't move. Just stood there, tears streaming down her face, and repeated it. I've been with someone else for 10 years, Dan. I laughed. It wasn't a real laugh. It was that kind of laugh you let out when something is so absurd, so impossible, that your mind refuses to accept it. 10 years. That had to be a joke. A cruel, twisted joke. No, I said, shaking my head. No, that can't be right. You're messing with me. We've been together. We've been happy. Dan, she took a step closer, her eyes pleading with me to understand. I'm sorry. I didn't want it to be like this. I didn't want to hurt you. But I can't do this anymore. I'm leaving. I could feel the room spinning, my mind desperately trying to make sense of what she was saying. 10 years. Who? How? We had just gotten back from this amazing trip. We had been laughing, talking, connecting in ways we hadn't in years. How could that be fake? How could any of it be fake? You're leaving me. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, hollow and distant. She nodded, biting her lip as she wiped her tears again. I've been living a lie, Dan. I thought I could do it, I thought I could make it work, but I can't. Not anymore. I wanted to say something. I wanted to yell, to scream, to do anything to stop the avalanche of pain that was crashing down on me. But I couldn't. All I could do was stand there, frozen, as everything I thought I knew about my life, about her, crumbled around me. Rebecca stood there, her face full of regret, guilt, and something else I couldn't quite place. And in that moment, I realized something that scared me more than anything. I didn't know her anymore. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall, and the faint rustle of wind outside. But inside me, everything was chaos. My thoughts were racing, crashing into each other with no room to settle. 10 years. A decade. How had I missed it? How could I have been so blind? I leaned back against the wall, my legs suddenly feeling weak. Rebecca didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me, waiting for something, anything, from me. But what was I supposed to say? What was I supposed to feel? So, who is it? The words came out before I could stop them. I didn't want to know, but at the same time, I needed to know. I needed to understand how something like this could happen right under my nose. Rebecca hesitated, her eyes flicking to the floor. His name is Eric. Eric. I rolled the name over in my head, searching for any kind of connection. Did I know an Eric? Was he someone we both knew? A neighbor? A coworker? My mind was grasping at straws, trying to find a way to make sense of this. Do I know him? My voice was sharper than I intended, but I couldn't help it. My emotions were fraying at the edges, threatening to unravel completely. She shook her head slowly. No. He's someone I met at work. He used to work in another department, but we ran into each other a lot. And then, things just happened. I laughed again, but it was the same hollow, bitter sound as before. Things just happened. You make it sound so simple, Rebecca. Like you accidentally tripped and fell into an affair. Her face crumpled, and she took a step toward me, but I held up my hand, stopping her in her tracks. I didn't want her anywhere near me right now. I needed space to think, to process everything that had just been thrown at me. 10 years, I said, my voice shaky. You've been with this guy for 10 years, and I never noticed. You came home to me every night, acted like everything was fine. Like we were fine. How? How could you do that? She opened her mouth to speak but then closed it, as if she didn't have the words. Or maybe she knew that no words could make this better. Dan, it wasn't like that. I mean, yes, it was wrong, but I never meant to hurt you. Never meant to hurt me. My voice rose, anger boiling up from deep inside. You've been lying to me for a decade, Rebecca. You've been sleeping with someone else while pretending everything was normal between us. How do you think that feels? She flinched, and for a moment, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. Good. Let her feel some of this pain. Let her see what it's like to be blindsided like this. I didn't plan for it to happen, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It happened, and once it started, I didn't know how to stop it. Stop it? I repeated, shaking my head in disbelief. You didn't know how to stop it. How about not starting it in the first place? How about not betraying your husband for 10 years? She bit her lip, and I could see her struggling to hold back more tears. But I didn't care. I didn't have any sympathy left in me right now. I know I messed up, she said, her voice cracking. I know I hurt you, and I'll never be able to make that right. But I can't keep living this lie. I can't keep pretending. I let out a long, shaky breath and ran a hand through my hair. The weight of everything was pressing down on me, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. My life, our life, had been a lie. All those moments we shared, the vacations, the holidays, the quiet nights at home, they were all tainted now. I had been living in a fantasy while she had been living a completely different reality. Why now? I asked, my voice raw. Why tell me this now? After everything we've been through, after this trip, why now? Rebecca wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at me, her gaze filled with sorrow. Because I couldn't keep doing this to you. To us. After the kids left for college, I thought I could make it work, that I could stay with you and leave Eric behind. But I realized. I'm not happy, Dan. I haven't been for a long time. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Not happy. That was what this was all about. She hadn't been happy, so she went and found someone else. How long had she felt like this? And why hadn't she said anything? So, what now? I asked, my voice quieter than before. You're just going to walk away? After everything we've built, after all these years, you're leaving me for him? She looked away, her hands trembling as she spoke. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't even know if I'm going to be with him. I just know I can't stay here. Not like this. It's not fair to you. I stared at her, the woman I had loved for so long, the mother of my children, and I couldn't recognize her anymore. I couldn't reconcile the person standing in front of me with the woman I thought I knew. It was like I was looking at a stranger. The memories we shared began flooding my mind. Our wedding day, when she had smiled at me with those same eyes, promising me forever. The day our first child was born, and we had cried together, overwhelmed with joy. The little moments in between, the quiet mornings with coffee, the late-night talks, the way she used to hold my hand when we walked down the street. Had all of that been a lie, too? Dan, her voice pulled me out of my thoughts. I'm sorry. I really am. Sorry. I repeated, feeling the anger rise again. You're sorry. That's it? You destroy everything we had, and all you have to say is that you're sorry. She shook her head, her face full of pain. I don't know what else to say. Then don't say anything, I snapped, pushing myself off the wall and stepping away from her. Just, don't. I couldn't look at her anymore. I couldn't stand the sight of her standing there, pretending to be sorry for something that had shattered my entire world. I needed space. I needed air. I needed to get out of this house before I lost it completely. I need to go, I muttered, my voice tight. Dan, wait. But I didn't. I grabbed my keys from the counter and walked out the front door, slamming it behind me. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there. Not with her. Not after everything. The cool evening air hit my face as I stepped outside, and for a moment, I just stood there, breathing it in, trying to calm the storm inside me. But the storm wasn't going anywhere. It was raging, tearing me apart from the inside out. I got into my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there, staring at the house, the home we had built together. The home where we had raised our kids, where we had lived a life I thought was real. But it wasn't. It was all a lie. And now, I had to figure out how to live with that. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours. The roads blurred past me, the streetlights casting long shadows on the empty streets. I didn't know where I was going or what I was trying to outrun, but I couldn't sit still. My mind was racing, replaying everything Rebecca had said, everything she hadn't said. How did we get here? How had I missed the signs? 10 years. 10 years of betrayal, and I had been blind to it. All those little moments that didn't make sense before started to piece together now. The late nights she said she was working late. The weekends when she'd go out with friends and come back smelling like a different brand of cologne. How had I been so naive? I pulled over into a gas station parking lot and turned off the engine. My hands were still trembling, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes, trying to make sense of the mess that my life had suddenly become. I thought about our kids, Alex and Katie. They had no idea. How could they? Rebecca had kept this hidden from all of us. I wondered how they would feel if they knew the truth. Would they be as blindsided as I was? Or had they picked up on something I had missed? The weight of it all pressed down on me, suffocating, as if I was drowning in the realization that everything I had known, everything I had believed, was gone. I thought we had a good life. Sure, we had our problems, but what marriage didn't? We had weathered storms before, financial troubles, job stress, raising 2 kids. But I had never once doubted her. I had never thought for a second that she was capable of this. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the tidal wave of emotions that was threatening to break me apart. Anger, confusion, betrayal, they all churned inside me, fighting for space in my head. And underneath it all, there was the hurt. The kind of hurt that settles deep in your bones, the kind that doesn't just go away with time. I thought about the trip we had just taken. It felt like a cruel joke now. We had laughed, talked about the future, and shared moments that felt genuine. But was any of it real? Or had she just been going through the motions, pretending like everything was fine when it wasn't? The sound of footsteps snapped me out of my thoughts. A young guy was walking past, heading into the gas station, but he glanced at me for a moment, probably noticing the look on my face. I must have looked like a wreck. I certainly felt like one. I didn't move. I didn't get out of the car. I just sat there, staring out at the dimly lit parking lot, my mind still reeling. I couldn't go home. Not yet. The thought of walking back into that house, of seeing Rebecca again, made me sick to my stomach. How was I supposed to face her after what she had just told me? How was I supposed to look her in the eye and pretend like we could just go back to the way things were? I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts mindlessly. I didn't even know who I was looking for. My brother, maybe. He'd listen, but I wasn't ready to talk. Not yet. Talking about it would make it real, and I wasn't ready to accept that this was my new reality. Instead, I ended up calling a motel on the other side of town. The voice on the other end was chipper, a little too cheerful for the kind of night I was having, but I booked a room anyway. At least there, I could be alone with my thoughts without the weight of the house crushing me. I started the car again, pulling out of the parking lot and heading toward the motel. The streets were mostly empty now, a few cars here and there, but nothing to distract me from the mess swirling in my head. How could she do this to me? To us? As I drove, my mind wandered back to when we first met. I could still remember the way she smiled at me that first day. It had been at a party, one of those casual get-togethers where no one really knew each other but somehow found themselves stuck in the same room. She had been standing across the room, laughing with some friends, and when our eyes met, there was this spark. I felt it, and I knew she did too. I remember how nervous I was when I walked up to her. She had this way of looking at you, like she could see right through you, and it made my heart race. But she smiled, that same smile I had fallen in love with, and before I knew it, we were talking, laughing, and by the end of the night, I couldn't stop thinking about her. We had built a life together. A good life. Or at least, I thought it was good. I thought we were happy. But now, I was questioning everything. Every memory, every moment. How much of it was real? How much of it had been a lie? By the time I pulled into the motel parking lot, my head was spinning. I parked the car and sat there for a minute, staring at the neon sign flickering above the entrance. It felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life. This wasn't supposed to happen. We were supposed to grow old together, watch our kids graduate, travel the world when we retired. We were supposed to be a team. But now, it felt like I didn't even know who Rebecca was anymore. I checked in, barely registering the clerk's words as he handed me the key. The room was small, basic, just a bed, a chair, and a TV. But it was quiet, and that was all I needed right now. I dropped my bag by the door and collapsed onto the bed, staring up at the ceiling, the events of the night replaying over and over in my mind. I kept hearing her voice. I've been seeing someone else, for over 10 years. Those words felt like knives in my chest, each one twisting deeper the more I thought about them. 10 years. How could she look at me every day and keep that secret? How could she lie so easily, so effortlessly? And the worst part was, I had no idea. I had no idea that the woman I loved was living another life behind my back. I closed my eyes, willing the memories to stop, but they wouldn't. Every moment, every conversation we'd had over the past 10 years, felt tainted now. I wondered if she was thinking about him when she was with me. I wondered if she was comparing us. If I was just the convenient option, the one she stayed with because it was easier than leaving. I grabbed my phone, scrolling through our old photos. There she was, smiling, laughing, holding our kids. We looked happy. We were happy, weren't we? But now I didn't know. I didn't know anything anymore. I threw the phone onto the bed, letting out a frustrated groan. I needed to clear my head, but it felt like I was stuck in quicksand, sinking deeper and deeper into the mess Rebecca had created. I sat up, staring at the dark window across from me. For the first time in my life, I felt truly lost. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know how to move forward from this. But I did know one thing. Things would never be the same. Not after tonight. I woke up the next morning in the motel, the harsh light filtering through the thin curtains. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The bed was unfamiliar, the air stale. Then, like a sledgehammer, the memories of the night before hit me all over again. Rebecca. The betrayal. The lies. I groaned and sat up, running a hand over my face. My eyes felt gritty, like I hadn't slept at all. I glanced at my phone, half expecting a text from her. Maybe she'd try to explain more, say something to make it all better. But there was nothing. Just silence. I stared at the screen, debating whether I should call her or not. A part of me wanted to, demand answers, yell, ask her why she had thrown everything away. But what was the point? She'd already made her decision. She had been making that decision for the past 10 years without me even knowing. With a frustrated sigh, I got up and paced the small room. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, the weight of everything suffocating. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't just sit around, letting the anger and hurt eat me alive. I needed to get out. Do something. Anything. I grabbed my keys, stuffing my wallet in my pocket, and left the room, the door clicking shut behind me. Outside, the air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside me. I got in the car and started driving, not caring where I went, just needing to be away from everything. As the miles passed, my thoughts began to settle, but they kept circling back to Rebecca. How could she have lived with herself, lying to me for so long? I kept thinking about our life together, all the moments we shared. I remembered our last anniversary, the way she had smiled at me across the table, the way we had held hands as we walked through the park afterward. Had she been thinking of him then? Was he always there, a shadow hanging over us, and I was just too blind to see it? Eventually, I ended up on the outskirts of town, near a small diner we used to visit when we were first married. It was one of those places that never seemed to change, no matter how much time passed. I hadn't been there in years, but for some reason, it felt like the only place I could go. I pulled into the parking lot, the gravel crunching beneath the tires, and sat there for a minute, staring at the entrance. The place looked exactly the same. Faded sign, chipped paint, the same neon light buzzing faintly in the window. I remembered how we used to come here on Saturday mornings, sharing pancakes and coffee, laughing about nothing and everything. Back when things were simple. Back when I thought we had the world ahead of us. I got out of the car and headed inside. The bell above the door jingled, and the familiar smell of coffee and bacon hit me. It was almost comforting. Almost. I found a booth in the corner and sat down, the worn leather creaking beneath me. A waitress came over, a woman in her 50s with a tired but kind smile, and handed me a menu. "What can I get for you, hon?" she asked, her pen poised over the notepad. I glanced at the menu, but I wasn't hungry. Not really. My stomach was in knots, but I ordered coffee anyway. "Just black coffee, please." She nodded and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts again. I stared out the window, watching as cars passed by on the main road. It was strange how life just kept moving, even when everything felt like it was falling apart. The coffee arrived a few minutes later, and I wrapped my hands around the warm cup, taking a sip. It was bitter, but it woke me up, grounding me in the moment. I needed that. I tried to distract myself, looking around the diner. The few patrons scattered throughout were caught up in their own lives, oblivious to the mess I was going through. There was a couple a few tables away, laughing softly, leaning into each other. They reminded me of how Rebecca and I used to be. It made my chest tighten, the familiar ache of loss creeping in again. I thought about all the times we had sat in this very diner, talking about our future, about the kids we wanted to have, the life we wanted to build. Back then, everything seemed so clear. We were on the same page, moving toward the same goals. Now, it felt like I had been walking this path alone for years, while she had been on a completely different one. I leaned back in the booth, closing my eyes. The memories kept coming, uninvited. Our first apartment. The day we found out she was pregnant with Alex. I had been so nervous, but she had just laughed, her eyes sparkling with excitement. And when Katie came along, we were in the thick of it, juggling jobs, kids, bills. But we had always been a team. At least, I thought we were. Had she been unhappy even then? Was this affair something that started because she was lonely, because I hadn't been there enough? Or had I just been a placeholder for her all along, a safe option while she got what she really wanted from someone else? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more painful than the last. But no matter how hard I tried to piece it together, I couldn't find an answer that made sense. I felt a presence near me and opened my eyes to see the waitress standing there again, refilling my coffee. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders, hon," she said, her voice soft with concern. I forced a smile. Yeah, something like that. She gave me a sympathetic nod and walked away, leaving me with my thoughts once more. I stared at the fresh cup of coffee, but I didn't take another sip. Instead, I just sat there, letting the silence settle around me. I kept thinking about Rebecca's face when she told me. The way she had cried, the way her voice had trembled with guilt. But there was something else in her eyes, something that wasn't just guilt or regret. There was relief. As if telling me the truth had finally lifted a weight off her shoulders. That realization hit me harder than I expected. She was relieved. She had been carrying this secret for so long, living a double life, and now that it was out in the open, she could breathe again. But what about me? What about the weight she had just dumped on me, the pain she had caused? I pushed the coffee cup away and stood up, throwing some money on the table for the bill. I couldn't sit here anymore, couldn't keep running through the same thoughts over and over. As I stepped outside, the cool air hit me again, but this time, it didn't bring the same kind of relief. I was still trapped in my head, still drowning in the betrayal, and no amount of fresh air was going to fix that. I got back in the car and drove, heading in the direction of home. But the closer I got, the more I realized I wasn't ready to face Rebecca. I wasn't ready to have that conversation, to hear more excuses or apologies. So instead of going home, I drove past our street and headed toward the only place that felt safe right now, my brother's house. He lived about an hour away, far enough that I wouldn't just run into Rebecca by accident, but close enough that I could get there without thinking too much. When I finally pulled into his driveway, I sat there for a moment, debating whether I should even go in. But before I could decide, the front door opened, and there he was, Mike, my older brother. He took one look at me, his face softening with concern, and without saying a word, he waved me inside. I stepped out of the car, and as I walked toward the house, the weight of everything began to feel just a little bit lighter. But I knew, deep down, this was only the beginning of the storm. Mike didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. We'd always had that kind of unspoken understanding, especially when things were bad. He just motioned for me to come in and headed toward the kitchen, where he grabbed a couple of beers from the fridge. He handed one to me and sat down at the small table, waiting for me to start whenever I was ready. I sat across from him, the bottle cold in my hands, and stared at the label for a while. I wasn't sure how to even begin. How do you explain to someone that the life you thought you had was a lie? That the woman you loved had been betraying you for a decade? It felt too big, too overwhelming to put into words. Finally, I let out a long sigh and took a swig of the beer. Rebecca's been having an affair, I said, my voice flat, like I was talking about something that had happened to someone else. Mike didn't react right away. He just nodded, taking it in. How long? He asked after a beat, his tone careful. 10 years, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Saying it out loud felt like being punched all over again. She's been with someone else for 10 years, Mike. I had no idea. He whistled softly, shaking his head. Damn, man. That's... I don't even know what to say. I laughed bitterly. Yeah, me neither. We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of it all hanging in the air. I could feel Mike's eyes on me, but he didn't push. He just let me sit with it, giving me space to say more if I wanted to. I don't even know how I missed it, I continued after a moment. How does something like that go on for so long without me noticing? Was I really that blind? Mike took a sip of his beer and leaned back in his chair, thinking for a moment. People can hide a lot when they want to, he said finally. It doesn't mean you were blind. It just means she was really good at hiding it. I shook my head. But 10 years, Mike. We've been raising kids, going on vacations, building a life together. How could she lie to me every day and still look me in the eye like nothing was wrong? He didn't have an answer for that, and I didn't expect him to. Hell, I didn't have an answer for it either. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice cracking slightly. I don't even know where to start. She told me last night, and I left. I couldn't handle it. Mike looked at me, his expression serious. You don't have to figure it all out right now. Take it one step at a time. You're dealing with a huge betrayal, man. No one expects you to have the answers right away. I nodded, but it didn't feel like it would ever get easier. The pain, the confusion, it felt endless, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. What are you going to do? Mike asked carefully, watching me. I don't know, I said, shaking my head. She said she's leaving. I guess I'll let her. I don't even know if I could live with her after this. How could I? He nodded again, understanding. It's going to be rough, no matter what you decide. But you'll get through it. You always do. I wasn't so sure about that. This felt different. This felt like the kind of wound that never fully healed, the kind that changed you forever. We finished our beers in silence, and after a while, Mike started talking about his own life, work, his wife, the kids. It was comforting, in a way, to focus on something else, to hear about someone else's normal, everyday problems. But in the back of my mind, the betrayal still lingered, like a shadow I couldn't shake. Eventually, the conversation circled back around to me. Mike leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. Do you want to stay here for a while? He offered. You don't have to go back home if you're not ready. I appreciated the offer, but I shook my head. I don't know. I need to figure things out. But thanks. I just needed to get away for a bit, you know. He nodded, understanding. Well, you're always welcome here. Take as much time as you need. I thanked him, and we talked for a little while longer, but eventually, I knew I had to leave. I couldn't hide out at my brother's house forever. So, after a few hours, I said goodbye and got back in the car, heading toward home. I wasn't sure what I would find when I got there. Would Rebecca still be there, or had she already packed her things and left? The drive felt longer this time, the weight of everything settling back on my shoulders as I got closer to the house. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for a minute, staring at the front door. The house was dark. No sign of life inside. With a deep breath, I got out of the car and walked up to the door, pushing it open slowly. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes when something has fundamentally changed. I called her name once, but there was no answer. I walked through the house, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. In the living room, everything was as it had been when I left the night before. The only difference was a note on the kitchen counter. I stared at it for a moment, afraid to read what it said. But I couldn't avoid it forever. I picked up the note, my hands shaking slightly. Dan. I know this doesn't make anything better, but I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all the lies, for all the pain I've caused. I never wanted it to end like this, but I can't keep living a lie. I'm leaving, like I said I would. I've already packed my things, and I'll be staying with a friend for a while. Please, don't hate me. I know I've hurt you, but I never stopped caring about you. I hope one day you can forgive me, but I understand if you can't. Rebecca. I read the note twice, then a third time, but it didn't change anything. She was gone. Just like that. After 20 years of marriage, she was gone, and all I had left were the pieces of a life I thought I knew. I crumpled the note in my hand, feeling a surge of anger. How could she ask me not to hate her? How could she walk away from everything we built and expect me to forgive her? I stood there for a long time, the empty house echoing around me. The weight of it all settled in my chest, heavy and suffocating. But there was nothing I could do. Rebecca was gone. The life we had was gone. And now, I had to figure out how to pick up the pieces. I walked to the back porch, where we used to sit on summer evenings, talking about everything and nothing. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, the last traces of daylight fading away. I sank into one of the chairs, staring out at the yard, my mind numb. For so long, my life had been about us, Rebecca and me, our kids, our family. Now, it was just me. Alone, trying to make sense of a world that had been flipped upside down. As I sat there, the pain in my chest felt sharper, more real. But underneath it, there was something else. Something small, barely noticeable, but there. It was the beginning of acceptance. The realization that, no matter how much it hurt, life would go on. I would go on. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know how I would rebuild after this. But as the stars slowly began to appear in the sky, I realized that I had no choice but to keep moving forward. One step at a time.